You saw it coming. You even said it out loud. This is the same pattern. And then you did it anyway. That's the part that feels unfair. Not the mistake, not the repetition. The unfair part is this. You recognized it early. You named it accurately. You understood the mechanics, and it still ran. Because there's a quiet misconception people inherit about awareness, that seeing a pattern is the same as stopping it. It isn't. Insight changes how you interpret what's happening. It does not automatically change what happens next. And once you understand why, you don't unsee it, because the answer isn't emotional, it's structural. When you name a pattern, tension drops. Confusion becomes clarity. Clarity becomes relief. Relief feels like progress. But relief is not interruption. Relief is stabilization. It's the system inside you, your internal narrative engine, reducing noise. And that's valuable. It prevents panic. It reduces cognitive chaos. But it does something else too. It creates a false sense of movement because you feel calmer, more coherent, more in control. And control feels like leverage. But leverage is not a feeling. Leverage is an environmental fact. And insight doesn't create environmental force. It creates understanding. Understanding can reduce internal volatility, but it leaves external incentives intact. And behavior follows incentives more reliably than it follows vocabulary. That's the first hard principle. Language can stabilize identity. Only structure can redirect behavior. Think about it this way. If awareness were enough, you would have stopped already. That's not an insult. That's physics. If the cause was ignorance, your knowledge would have solved it. But your knowledge didn't solve it. So ignorance was never the root, which means the problem is not, why don't I understand? The problem is, why is this still rational for the system to do? Because repetition is rarely random. Repetition is often equilibrium. Most people believe they repeat behavior because they're missing information. But systems don't move because of information. Systems move because of consequences. Your brain tracks outcomes, not intentions. It measures consequence, not insight. And here's what makes repetition persistent. If the cost of repetition is tolerable, the pattern remains rational. You can explain a pattern perfectly and still repeat it if the penalty stays low. Because the system inside you isn't moral, it's adaptive. It learns one main lesson. What happens if we do this again? And if the answer is, things continue, then the pattern remains stable. Uncomfortable, yes. Embarrassing sometimes, but stable. And stability is persuasive. Stability is what keeps institutions alive. It's what keeps people functioning. And that's why patterns don't die from being recognized. They die from becoming expensive. Recognition is awareness. Change is redistribution. Different forces, different speeds. Recognition is cognitive. Change is structural. Recognition happens in language. Change happens in incentives. Recognition calms the nervous system. Change disrupts the equilibrium. And most advice traditions, especially modern ones, overemphasize willpower. Because willpower is a neat story. It makes the individual the central actor. It makes the solution feel personal and heroic. But willpower operates inside structure. Structure defines options. Structure defines friction. Structure defines cost. If nothing in your environment changes, your behavior has no structural reason to. So the pattern doesn't persist because it's powerful. It persists because it's permitted. Take a neutral example, a recurring relational dynamic. You know the trigger pattern. You know the script. You can predict the ending, and yet it repeats. Why? Because the consequences are managed. Nothing collapses. The social structure remains intact. The cost is real but tolerable. It's like a building with a cracked support beam that hasn't failed yet. Every day it remains standing. The system learns. This is survivable. So the pattern persists, not because you don't understand it, but because the architecture of consequence hasn't changed, because the system you're in, socially, emotionally, procedurally, still rewards the old behavior with continuity. Continuity is a reward, even when it's mediocre, especially when it's mediocre. Mediocrity is stable. Stability is seductive. Here's the question that exposes the mechanism. If you don't change, what actually happens? If the answer is not much, then the pattern has no reason to stop. That is not weakness. That is system logic. If the structure tolerates the behavior remains rational. That's why many people live inside patterns for years, fully aware, fully articulate, fully capable of analysis, and still repeating. Because analysis is not the same as pressure. Insight is not the same as consequence. This doesn't just apply to individuals, it applies to systems. Institutions issue statements. They admit mistakes. They publish reforms. Language improves. But if incentives remain unchanged, behavior remains unchanged. Acknowledgement is low cost. Redistribution is high cost. So systems choose acknowledgement. Individuals often do the same. Explanation stabilizes identity, but stability is not transformation. That's why certain organizations can become fluent in self-critique without becoming capable of structural change. They can narrate the problem beautifully. They can commission reports. They can hire consultants and still repeat the same decisions because the system isn't rewarded for changing. It's rewarded for appearing coherent while remaining intact. Consider a large organization after a public failure. A critical incident occurs. The response is swift on paper. A statement is drafted. A review is announced. A committee is formed. Every element signals seriousness. But then you watch what happens next. The review becomes a secondary review. The committee becomes a working group. The working group becomes a timeline. And the timeline becomes a shield. Each step is rational. Each layer is defensible. But together they create friction. The goal silently shifts from repairing the structure to managing exposure. Because exposure threatens reputation, and reputation is stored power. So the system delays, not from confusion, but from preservation. And preservation looks responsible. Until time passes, until external conditions shift, until the cost of delay becomes visible. The institution didn't fail to understand. It failed to pay the price of disruption early when disruption was cheapest. Because credibility can become a constraint. When you have more to lose, you move slower. Not because you're weak, because the cost of being wrong is higher. So here's the blunt translation. You don't stop patterns with insight. You stop patterns with leverage. And leverage is not a motivational speech. Leverage is a consequence that rises, a friction point that increases, a reward that moves, an environment that changes. Leverage is structural. Without leverage, the system continues. Not because the system is evil, because the system is stable. This is where it gets psychologically persuasive. Patterns feel personal. They feel like character. They feel like identity. But many patterns are not identity. They are the predictable output of a repeated environment. You can put a disciplined person into a structure that rewards procrastination and watch procrastination emerge. You can put a cautious person into a structure that punishes risk and watch caution harden into paralysis. Because structure doesn't just influence behavior, it trains it. That's why some of the most insightful people remain the most stuck. Because they can narrate the trap, But narration does not open the door. It only labels the room. If you want the cleanest model, it's this. Patterns persist because they protect equilibrium. Even bad equilibrium, especially bad equilibrium, because equilibrium is predictable, and predictability reduces threat. So the system chooses the known outcome over the uncertain alternative. This is why change has a cost curve. Early change is expensive emotionally but cheap structurally. Late change is cheap emotionally because you're exhausted, but expensive structurally because consequences have compounded. Systems, human and institutional, prefer late change because they prefer not to disrupt until disruption is forced. This is not a moral failing. It's a stability bias. So the next time you ask, why can't I stop? Ask instead, what would actually change if I did? Not in theory, in consequence, in cost, in friction, in incentives. Because that question reveals whether your awareness is paired with leverage or whether awareness is simply stabilizing the current structure. And if awareness is only stabilizing the structure, the pattern will keep running calmly forever. Insight changes how you feel. It does not automatically change what you do, because insight stabilizes identity. Only consequence destabilizes structure. You can know something completely and still be governed by it, not because you're weak, not because you're unaware, because stability is comfortable, and comfort resists interruption. The pattern doesn't stop when you understand it. The pattern stops when the system can no longer afford it. That's the mechanism. That's why you saw it coming and still did it. And that's why once you see it, you won't unsee it.